So, tonight we're going to move into a new part of our study where we're going to look at several texts that suggest cosmic redemption. The New Heavens, New Earth perspective basically says that God intends to redeem and restore all of creation, not just humans. And there are several texts that suggest that. In fact, you had several passages that you were supposed to read for homework. And these are interesting. I don't know, I'm sure you've read these before, but you probably maybe picked up on some things this time that you hadn't picked up on before, or maybe even still you read them and you're like, I have no idea why Luke wanted us to read these. It seems completely random. So we're going to go through these, but for me, these are verses that even after I had kind of come around this way of thinking, I didn't actually know what a lot of these verses said until I started reading some more. But we're going to look at them, we're going to examine them one by one and kind of put them together and see what they're telling us. As we look at these passages, which all describe God's salvation in some sense, we're going to ask two questions. Number one, how is salvation described in this passage? And number two, what is the object or recipient of God's salvation in this passage? Who or what gets saved? When we talk about salvation, we almost entirely think of salvation means my sins are forgiven, my soul is saved, I can go to heaven when I die. Now, we've already talked about some of that stuff. The Bible never says, go to heaven when we die, right? We don't find that in Scripture anywhere. That's not the Christian hope. The Christian hope is what happens when Jesus returns, right? Not what happens immediately when we die. And so, certainly salvation involves forgiveness of sins. Certainly salvation involves eternity with God. I don't want to deny that anyway. But a lot of times when we think of salvation, we think pretty narrowly on, I get to be saved, and when I die, I go to heaven. Salvation is broader than that. We're going to look at some passages tonight that talk about salvation in a cosmic sense, very wide and very broad. So these are the two questions I want you to keep in mind. Okay, if you have Bibles, pull them out because we're going to go through some different texts tonight. If you did your homework, please be familiar. And I would like to have some readers to help me out tonight. The first one is Acts chapter 3, verses 19 through 21. I'm going to call on Brent because I always do. I know he'll do it for me. But if some other people would be willing to read, that'd be great. Brent, Acts chapter 3, verses 19 through 21. Read loud for us, please.
Repent therefore and turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that ye may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all the things about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets long ago.
Okay, so here in context, Peter is preaching the gospel outside of the temple, and there's really not a lot of detail in this passage. Peter just kind of makes mention of something. It's somewhat cryptic, but if we go back and look at our two questions, I think we can still see the answers from this passage. How is salvation described in this passage, and who or what gets saved? So, he's talking, and he says, Jesus is in heaven until the time comes when he's going to come back, and we're going to have salvation in some sense. And he describes that as, depending on your translation, something like restoring all the things, or universal restoration. The Greek words for the restoration is apokatastasis, which is only used here in the New Testament, but we have a pretty good idea what that means from other Greek texts outside of the New Testament, and it means restoration, the restoring of something. Like if you have a classic car that you want to restore, what you're trying to do is make it like new, right?
Restore it to its former self.
Restore, yeah. And so, I don't know why I only use metaphors that I can't explain very well. I need to work on that. But okay, when you got a classic car and you want to restore it, you want to try to get original parts, right? Yeah. Okay. Help me out. Yeah. Okay. Good. And so you're not trying to get brand new stuff that doesn't fit. You're trying to, I mean, as much as possible, you're trying to get that thing to be as good as it was when it came off the line. If you were as good, if God was a mechanic, He'd make it brand new, right? Restoring your car. This is the idea of this word, restoration. It's what it means. Also, the word panta just means all, everything, each. So, according to Peter, in this passage, salvation has kind of two characteristics that we want to emphasize, and I'll keep using these words tonight. Number one, it is restorative, and number two, it is holistic. It is restorative in that it is seeking to fix what sin has broken. Sin makes a mess. Salvation seeks to undo that mess and fix what is broken. It is holistic in that it affects everything. We don't really use the word holistic a lot, maybe like holistic medicine, where they're trying to do more than just treat your body, but they're also trying to kind of address your mind and different things. And so this idea of holistic, it affects everything, not just a part of us, like our souls, and not just us, but more than just humans. So holistic and restorative. And Peter says, this is interesting, that God has talked about this through the mouths of the prophets. This is at the end of verse 21. Later in our study, not tonight, but later, we're going to kind of track some of this idea throughout Scripture, and we're going to see a lot in the Old Testament as well. But it's worth keeping in mind that Peter says that cosmic redemption is something that has been prophesied about. So this is a brief text. I don't think it's all that clear, really. I think it's a little bit more clear when we compare it to some of the other texts that we're going to look at. All right? Any questions about this before we move on? And if you have questions that come up later, we can come back to this. All right. Next is Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 10. Ephesians 1, 3 through 10. And I need another reader. Derek, please. Thank you.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in heavenly places, even as He chose us in Him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before Him. In love He predestined us for adoption to Himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of His will, to the praise of His glorious grace with which He has blessed us in the beloved. In Him we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of His grace, which He lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of His will according to His purpose, which He set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in Him, things in heaven and things on earth.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So we're really going to focus on verses 9 and 10, but I wanted you to see all of this. Paul has this tendency when he's writing to write very, very long sentences. In Greek, this is one sentence. Like it just goes on and on and on. So, for context, I wanted to see the whole thing. What Paul is doing here, he basically is discussing God's plan of salvation. He talks about different things that God does as part of saving us. So like verse 5, He predestines us to adopt us into His family. Verse 7, we have redemption in Him through His blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses. We're going to really zoom in on verses 9 and 10. And looking at those verses, how is salvation described in this passage? Who or what gets saved? Well, it says that God is going to gather up or unite all things in Christ, depending on your translation. Things that have been scattered or alienated because of sin. Sin breaks things. If you imagine like a clay pot or something, it just breaks up into pieces. And the idea here is that God is going to gather the pieces back and unite them back together. What will be saved? It says, all things, things in heaven and on earth. If you think back to one of our earlier lessons, heaven and earth, we see this pairing in Scripture all the time, right? We tend to think of heaven and hell. But we really don't see that we don't see that pairing in Scripture anywhere. We don't see heaven and hell. We see heaven and earth over and over and over again. In fact, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Yeah. So we see this pairing over and over again. And the idea here is salvation is going to be as widespread as creation was. As a plan for the fullness of time. Well, let me back up. Verse 9. God's making known to us the mystery of His will according to His purpose, which He set forth in Christ. This plan is happening through Christ as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things in Him, things in heaven and things on earth. So salvation is going to be as widespread as creation was, and we're really going to see that in this next passage we're going to look at. So we're kind of building here, all right? We've got these ideas of restoration. We have this idea of God bringing all these things back together again. And next we want to look at Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Do I have someone who would like to read that? Will. Colossians 1, 15 through 20. This is speaking about Jesus. I'll stop talking now.
The Son is the image of the invisible God, firstborn over all creation. For in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross.
All right, this is, I really like this passage of Scripture. This is some of the most elevated language about Jesus that you'll find in the Bible. A lot of scholars think that this might have been an early church hymn that Paul is borrowing from here and sticks it in his letter because it makes his point so well. We talk about Jesus a lot, and especially when we talk about Him, maybe because it's impossible, I just don't think we fully appreciate how amazing He is. I think we do a pretty good job talking about Jesus as Savior, as Redeemer, and this passage certainly emphasizes this, but it also talks about Jesus as Creator and Sustainer. Creator, Sustainer, and Redeemer. Talking about how all things that are were created by Him and through Him. When we read Genesis 1:1, it doesn't talk about Jesus being there, but we know here from Paul that He was, and that He was, His creative agency was involved in the creation of the world. So Jesus is involved in the creation of all things. Also, this idea of sustainer. I don't think we think about this a lot, but I mean, here we are, breathing this mixture of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, which is just this kind of precise balance on this ball of rock that is not too hot and not too cold, and just the right distance from the sun, and spinning really fast and hurtling through space. When you talk about it that way, it sounds kind of precarious, and maybe it is. And all of this is upheld and sustained through Jesus. Like, that's kind of incredible. Like, on some level we know that. On another level, I don't think we really pause to reflect. Like, our very lives continue to exist, and everything we know about life continues to exist because Jesus is actively sustaining it. It's part of what Paul says here, right? That was completely unrelated, just kind of a little sidebar or soapbox. But Jesus is incredible. This is an incredible passage, talking about Him as the Creator, Sustainer, and Redeemer. So how is salvation described in this passage? Who or what gets saved? Going back to our questions. Salvation is described in terms of reconciliation. Reconciliation means making peace between two parties who are at enmity with one another. We don't really use the word enmity a lot, so they're fighting. That their relationship is fractured, and there's a barrier in between them. In this case, the barrier is sin, and Jesus makes peace through the blood of His cross. When Jesus died on the cross, His blood removed the barrier of sin, making it possible for us to be reconciled to God again. So I think we're familiar with the idea of reconciliation. The thing is, we tend to think of this in very individualistic terms. Jesus died for me. Jesus died for Luke Dockery so I could be saved. And that's true. I don't want to deny that. But that's not actually the focus of this passage. This text emphasizes something different. The reconciliation made possible by Jesus is applied to all things, whether on earth or in heaven. Look at verse 19 again. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, verse 20, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. This is a pretty bold claim. This clearly refers to more than just humans. Whatever reconciliation is going on here is about more than just humans. Look at verse 16. For by him, by Christ, all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Okay, you just heard me say that. It's about creation. What did Jesus not create? Okay, you're the worst. Yeah, okay, so, if we eliminate logical inconsistencies, there's nothing that exists that Jesus didn't create, right? I mean, that's what it says, right? All things, everything, like visible, invisible, and all the stuff.
John 1:1 says the same thing.
Yeah, John 1:1 says the same thing. All right, so that's him as creator. Verse 17 is him as sustainer. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So what is not holding together through Jesus? Nothing, right? All things are holding together through him. So same language, creation, sustaining, and then look at verse 20, which we've already looked at. Through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So, all things, whether on earth or in heaven, will be reconciled or redeemed in him. So, let's let this sink in for a moment and reflect. You see the point that I'm making? Does this passage teach that Jesus is going to redeem humans? Yes. But does it teach that only humans are going to be reconciled? No. Because why? Because it says all things. And if all things means all things in creation, and in the next verse it means all things when in Jesus' role as sustainer, it's got to also mean all things in his role as redeemer and reconciler. Do you follow me? Now, what does that mean exactly? I don't know. But it means something. It doesn't mean, well, just humans. Because it says all things. Right? We want to take the text seriously. It has to mean something. We have a pretty good handle on what it means when creation. And so the same language is used to describe how he's sustaining the world and all things and how he's going to redeem all things. Alright? Redemption is as wide as creation. It is cosmic in scope. Next passage. Romans chapter 8, verses 8. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, everything's not in heaven though right now. So it's like, so the idea is, there's a lot of stuff down here that need to be redeemed. Like, I do desperately, right? And so the idea is, sin breaks everything. So in a sense, everything needs to be redeemed. I mean, so in heaven, like in God's realm, things are good. But down, I'm sorry. Now I see what you're saying. What needs to be redeemed up there? Because he says he's going to redeem all things in heaven and on earth. It's a good question. I don't know.
I think it's his desire to be, God desires to be with us.
Right.
I mean, otherwise, the whole plan is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say, in some sense, like, the relationship between us and God still needs to be redeemed, and that's kind of something that spans both of our locations. Yeah. I mean, it's got to be brought together, and yeah. So something's got to happen, right, to make us come together, Will?
I mean, it talks about principalities and stuff like that, and kind of get into that.
Yeah.
On heavenly hosts, they talk about it in Job and stuff, and like, Satan is up and popping.
Right, and so another thing we have to keep in mind, and I haven't always done a great job in this class. I mean, sometimes heaven and earth, like sometimes heaven is like that place where God is, and we're down here, and sometimes like heaven and earth means like everything, right? Like God created the heavens and earth, it's referring to everything. But the idea being, if you think, go back to the beginning, heaven and earth meant to be together, they're driven apart. And this kind of goes back to what you're saying. The whole thing needs to be reconciled because it's meant to be together. So I think that's kind of the idea that's going on. Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 23. And I could use another reader for this. Yes, Todd, thank you.
I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies.
All right, thank you. I like this passage a lot. I think it's really neat. It's also really weird because creation is kind of given, it's personified. It's given characteristics of like people. It's like groaning. But the background of this passage lies in the fall of man in Genesis 3 and the fact that a curse is placed on creation itself because of human sin. When I say that, are you following me? Do we need to go look at Genesis 3, the curse placed on creation, or are we good? This is good. This is like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, there's actually a couple verses.
There are, I mean, there's a bunch of curses. I think there's one on creation. Well, there's not, it's kind of, again, Cain and Abel.
There's childbirth.
Yeah, but I would say that's on people rather than, we'll get into that stuff, but like there's the ground itself. So the earth itself is cursed.
But then that's lifted after Noah.
I don't think so. Check out.
Right. So,
Well, no, it's like I would like to talk about that. Will and I like to debate stuff.
So do you want to talk about
there is a part where it talks about, like, in a sense, we have a reboot, but we still have, if you read like Revelation 21, the curse doesn't go away until when Jesus returns. But so we got a curse placed on creation.
Curse is the ground because of you.
Curse is the ground because of you. And the background of this passage in Romans 8 is this curse that's on creation. Like, creation is subjected to futility and frustration. Since, like, in the Garden of Eden, did we have tsunamis and earthquakes and things like this? Well, the text doesn't actually say. I really don't think so. All right? And we're actually going to get into this more next week. So Will and I can have our debate then. But there's this curse placed on creation. That is the background of this passage in Romans chapter 8. And the source of that curse, is it something that creation did? No. Why is creation cursed? Because we sinned, right? I mean, I say we, like our great-great-great-great-grandparents did. If we were there, we would have done it too. That's kind of the whole point, right? So because of human sin, creation is placed under a curse. It's been subjected to futility and is under bondage to decay. Both the whole creation and we ourselves long for redemption. So in this passage, which is kind of different from some of the others, how is salvation described? Who or what gets saved? Well, first off, salvation is described in this passage as liberation. Creation is under bondage. Salvation is being liberated, being set free from that bondage. It's also described as redemption. Creation itself is going to be liberated, and we ourselves long for the redemption of our own bodies. What is this a reference to? Longing for the redemption of our bodies. What's that about? In what sense will our bodies be redeemed? I don't hear a little bit. I'm sorry? Yeah, we're not going to, in what sense? How are we going to not decay anymore? What are we going to get? New bodies. new bodies. And we're gonna talk about new bodies later. Having a resurrection body is central to our hope as Christians. We almost never talk about it. Like 1 Corinthians 15 is all about that. Resurrection bodies. They're weird. I don't exactly understand them. We're gonna try to sort through some of this stuff, but we're gonna get new bodies in the resurrection. We're not just gonna float around like Casper. We're gonna have new bodies in some sense, and those are significant. This is a reference to that. I'm 35, and I at times feel like my body is groaning, and some of you are laughing at me because you're like, oh, to be 35 again. But it's like, Will and I like to think of ourselves as athletes. We've been playing like the Frisbee for a long time, and we're done. I mean, like, our bodies just don't do the same things they used to, and like, when they do the wrong things and they break, like, they don't heal quickly or ever. And so, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, those of you who are much, much older than me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, our bodies, and like, you can actually hear them groaning sometimes. Like Caroline and I will work out at home sometimes. We'll do squats. Every time I do it, this knee groans. It pops every time. Okay, so like literally our bodies groan in certain ways. And this idea that we're needing redemption. Our bodies are breaking down, wearing down, which is not really the original plan. We're supposed to live in the garden, have access to the tree of life. We don't. So they break down. So we yearn for something more than that. All right, so we'll talk more about the resurrection of the body in a few weeks. Last passage. Now, I didn't have you read this one because it's going to be very familiar to you. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 13. This is the last one. If I can get one more reader, you guys have been great. 2 Peter 3, 10 through 13.
But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with the roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its work will be burned up. Reading from the New American Standard. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning, and the elements will melt with intense heat. But according to his promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth, in which righteousness dwells.
All right, thank you. So we're not going to spend a real long time on this one because it should be familiar to us by now, but in context, Peter is giving a warning to those who scoff and think that judgment will never come. Things are going on as they always have, and he tells them that it indeed will come. So here, at the end of 2 Peter 3, he talks about how we should live lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for the coming day of God. Of course, the day of God is when Jesus is going to return, and salvation is going to occur. So, how is salvation described in this passage? Who or what gets saved? Well, we've studied this already. So we have this process of the earth and the works in it, verse 10, being laid bare or exposed. This is the word we talked about. King James, New King James, New American Standard will have something like burned up. That's not a translation issue. It's based on a bad version of the Greek text. You remember this discussion? Okay. So, we have this process of the earth and the works in it being disclosed or laid bare. And this is that idea of purification by fire that we spent quite a bit of time on 2 weeks ago, I think. Then we will have a new heavens and a new earth, and we talked about those and the words for new. Not brand new, neos, but renewed, kainos. A new version of what was before. Alright? So I saved this one for last, after we had exhausted it a couple weeks ago. So, we went through 5 different texts, and probably none of them are stuck in your mind, and that's okay. I want to put it all together as we close. I don't know if that's even, can you read that at all? At all? Maybe some of you can, some of you can't. If you didn't get a handout and would like a handout, I've got them, you can come get one at the end, and this chart's on there, and it is about as unreadable there as it is up there. Okay. But magnifying glass, you can see it. So putting all these together, 5 different scriptures. Acts chapter 3, verses 17 through 21. How is salvation described? Restoration. Restoring something like it was before. What is the object of God's saving work? Who or what is getting saved? Everything. All things. Right? Ephesians 1, 9 and 10. We read the whole passage, but we focused on the end part. Description of salvation, God gathering up that which has been scattered. Uniting that which has been alienated. Who or what gets saved? All things in heaven and on earth. Colossians 1:15. How is salvation described there? Reconciliation, right? We've got this broken relationship, the barrier of sin in between. Through the cross, Jesus removes the barrier and reconciles what? All things, whether in heaven or on earth. Romans 8:18 through 23. How is salvation described? Liberation, being set free from bondage, and then also redemption. Liberation for creation itself, which is under a curse. Redemption for our groaning bodies. And then finally, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 13, the description of salvation. The earth and the works in it are disclosed, are laid bare. Kind of this idea of purification, where the bad stuff has been burned away, has been removed. And then we've got renewal and making new. The heavens and earth have been renewed. Kainos. Okay, so putting all these together, kind of basic characteristics of salvation. And I'm not saying, by the way, that these are the only characteristics of salvation. I'm not. I'm saying that from these verses, these are some characteristics of salvation. Like we haven't really talked about forgiveness of sin. Is that a characteristic of salvation? Absolutely. Gift of the Holy Spirit. It's not in here anywhere. Is that a characteristic of salvation? Absolutely. So I'm not saying that this is exhaustive. I'm saying from these verses, these are characteristics of salvation. Does that make sense? Part of my whole point is salvation is very broad. It involves a lot of stuff. Number 1, salvation is restorative. God fixes what went wrong with creation. Restores. Secondly, who or what gets restored? And this is where that word holistic comes in. Who or what gets restored? All things. God intends to restore all things in heaven and on earth, including our bodies. So, salvation is not just about saving human souls. I'm not opposed to the idea of saying save souls. Like, I'm not opposed to that. Unless we think that somehow that's like, oh, we want to save part of you, but we don't care about your physical shell. That's not important. Because God, actually it says we're going to have resurrected bodies. He's going to redeem all of us. All right? When I say all of us, I mean all parts of us. I don't mean every person. Some will be saved, some will be lost. So, more than just human souls, but also more than just humans. There's a sense in which all of creation is going to be redeemed. I can't tell you exactly how that looks, but it's going to be encompassed in the process of how we get from this heavens and earth to the new heavens and new earth, 2 Peter 3. Yeah?
I think it ties in a little bit with Genesis 9, when God makes the rainbow and the clouds as a covenant. It's not just a covenant between God and man, it's a covenant between God and man.
And everything. Like, yeah, God, in Genesis 9, God doesn't just promise people, I'm not going to destroy the earth again. He's just through a flood. He's telling the earth he's not going to do it again. I mean, it is a covenant, yeah. And there's other places too. God cares a lot. I mean, God made creation. Like, He cares about it a lot more than we sometimes give Him credit for caring about it. There's a lot. I mean, there are times when they're going through the promised land, conquering it, He says, "Hey, make sure you don't tear up the trees." That's in there. I mean, we don't really normally like. He's like, "Hey, wipe out these evil people, but be careful with their gardens." Like God cares about creation. He does. All right. We don't have a lot of time. But you see, I'm not saying that you might fully understand. I'm not saying that I do either of these individual passages, but you see the consistent theme that we get when we compare these to one another. Salvation is about more than just Jesus came to save you, Keith Doty. He did. But more than that, everyone and everything. I mean, more than that too. What exactly does that mean and what does it look like? I don't know. I'm not claiming that, but what the text says is all things. And so I don't think that we should interpret that to mean, well, I don't know, not all things. I don't exactly know what it means, but it can't mean the opposite of what it says. Does that make sense? All right. I'm going to just flash the homework up. If there's any questions, we'll go ahead and ask them. For next week, read Genesis 3 and the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. There are a lot of different consequences that they, and therefore us, experience because of their sin. What are those consequences? We're going to talk about that. And here's kind of the idea. Salvation from sin, or the solution to the problem of sin, needs to be as widespread as the effects of sin. Does that make sense? Like, do we believe that Jesus defeats sin? That Jesus overcomes sin? So does that mean that Jesus needs to overcome all the bad effects of sin? Yes. So we're going to look at those effects. And we need to have a theology that enables Jesus to overcome all of the effects of sin and not just some of them. That's the teaser. That's your homework.